I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we the people learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. And for today's episode, is that annoying? Is that bothering you at all? Today is tax day in the United States, and I know, trust me, I know, I'm right there with you. But for today's episode, I thought I would tell a story that involves taxes, but ultimately leads to something bigger and better. April 19th will mark the 242nd anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord. The battles, for those of you that don't know your Revolutionary War history, are the ones that would essentially kick off the Revolutionary War. And that story, like all of the good ones, obviously begins with, you guessed it, taxes! In 1763, following the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War, the British looked at their coffers and they realized that money was running a bit low due to the amount that they had spent during that fight. So in order to get that money back, the Crown decided that the North American colonies would be taxed on an assortment of items and goods to recoup their losses. This would lead to a series of acts that Britain would pass on the colonies to get them to pay up. And the first one came in 1764 under the name the American Duties Act, aka the Sugar Act, which passed a tax on molasses, even though this act actually lowered the tax that you would pay on molasses. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act was levied, which passed a tax on paper products, including things like land deeds, liquor licenses, playing cards, almanacs, and newspapers. Now, from these acts, we get the colonist argument of taxation without representation. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this one. Taxation without representation meant that the colonists said that we shouldn't be paying these taxes because we have no voice in Parliament. We have no say in what happens to us here over in the colonies, so why are you passing stuff without our say? But the British just will not quit with the taxing. They love doing it. And so in 1767, the Townsend Duties are passed, which places a tax on the following goods: glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Now in 1770, the Townsend Duties would actually be repealed and taxes on all those goods would be taken away, save for one, which was the tax on tea. And in 1773, the Tea Act was passed. And hopefully you guys know how that story ends because it's been taught to us since elementary school. In December of 1773, a group of colonists, including one John Hancock, by the way, they dress up as Mohawk Indians and they go into Boston Harbor and they decide to have themselves a little bit of a tea party, taking the tea off the ships, dumping it into Boston Harbor. But the Boston Tea Party really upsets the British, and in 1774, they pass a slew of acts that would later become known as the Intolerable Acts. And what do the Intolerable Acts do? Well, the first thing they do is they cut off Boston Harbor from any ships bringing in any goods whatsoever. Secondly, it states that British soldiers had to be housed in the homes of colonists. Thirdly, any British soldiers that were charged with murder in the colonies didn't have to stand trial in the colonies. They would actually go back to England for that trial. And fourthly, no elections would happen in Boston whatsoever. It's safe to say that these intolerable acts were a bit, shall we say, intolerable, which is why in September of 1774, the first Continental Congress convenes at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, where delegates from all the colonies, except for Georgia, meet to discuss these acts. In addition to discussing the intolerable acts and how they would respond to them, they also discuss the idea of arming themselves. In the event that a fight has to go down, they want the colonists to be ready to go, which brings us up to speed. We are now at April 1775. And at this point, there are more British troops coming over to the colonies. Meanwhile, the colonists have started to stockpile ammunition and weapons in case they need them for a fight. And one of the places that they're stockpiling the ammunition and the weapons happens to be in Concord, Massachusetts. However, the British find out about this stockpile and they start making their way to Concord to seize all the weapons and ammo. Now, in order to warn the colonists that the British were en route, a couple things happen. You're probably very familiar with them at this point. First off, in the steeple of the Old North Church in Boston, 2 lamps are lit. Why? Because that was the signal. And the signal, of course, was if the British were going to be making their way to Concord by land, they were going to light 1 lamp. If they were going to come by the water, it would be 2 lamps. 1 if by land, to if by sea. You've all heard that phrase before. Furthermore, a group of colonists, including a silversmith and, according to the Beastie Boys, a good man named Paul Revere, ride through the night to warn everybody that the British are coming. All right, hotshots, time for a pop quiz. What did Paul Revere famously say during his midnight ride? Go ahead, yell it out if you know the answer. Let me hear you. Let me hear you. Right. Okay, yeah. The British are coming. The British are coming, right? You would be incorrect. Here's why that's incorrect. Because if Paul Revere were to ride around at night yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming, everybody would think he was out of his fucking mind. You have to remember that in 1775, the colonists aren't Americans yet. They're still British subjects. They're still British citizens, which means if somebody runs around at that time at 1775 yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming, everyone look at him and be like, no shit. We're already here. So what did Paul Revere actually yell during his midnight ride? He actually yelled, the regulars are coming out, the regulars are coming out, which referred to the actual British regular army, the troops that were coming towards them. Also, just a quick fun fact about our boy here, Paul Revere. During his midnight ride, he was actually captured by a British patrol. Smooth. So here we are, the morning of April 19, 1775. The scene, Lexington, Massachusetts. The two lamps in the steeple of the Old North Church had warned everybody. The midnight ride of Paul Revere and other colonists had warned everybody. And by now, a group of militia was standing in Lexington facing off against the British regular army. And as the colonial militia and the British regulars are facing off in Lexington, it's said that a British officer raised his voice and yelled to the militia to lay down their weapons. And then, out of nowhere, a single shot is fired. And to this day, we still don't know who fired off that shot. And for that matter, we don't really know which side fired off that shot first, if it was the colonial militia or the British regulars. But how about we just apply a little common sense to this scenario, huh? You've got an excited, anxious, nervous militia facing off one of the most well-disciplined armies in the world at that time. Who do you really think fired first? Now, following a brief skirmish at Lexington, it wasn't really much of a battle. It was just more of a dust-up more than anything else. The regulars continue on and make their way to Concord to try to find that stockpile of weapons. But it's at this time that even more militia, or Minutemen, as they were called, because it was said that they could be ready within a minute's notice, they make their way to Concord as well. They follow the British regulars and they keep engaging them, but not in the typical army fashion. Turns out that the regulars become incredibly overwhelmed by the amount of gunfire that's coming from everywhere. The militia is firing from the trees, behind walls, behind taverns, behind houses, but bullets just flying everywhere, while the British are trying to line up in formation and shoot and fire and fight properly. So eventually the British just start to retreat and they keep running and the militia keeps following them and they're running and the militia keeps following them. Eventually the British make it all the way to Charlestown, where they retreat and they actually get naval support from the British Navy that's waiting there. And at the end of the fighting, the news spread very quickly that the colonial militia was able to stand up against the British regulars and take them on. That news would eventually make it to England, and they would come back with more troops, and a full-on war for independence would begin later on. See? Sometimes taxes can lead to good things. In some cases, it's a refund check. In other cases, it's independence for a nation. And that is it for this episode of US 101, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out and for watching the videos. And for those of you that have subscribed to the channel, I can't thank you guys enough for your support. And thanks to all of you that have been sharing the videos and commenting and just getting involved, man. I love talking to you guys and I appreciate the support you guys are giving the channel. Please continue to do so. I would love more of you guys to get involved in US 101. As always, you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on the Instagram. All the links down below in the description box. Guys, I will see you next Tuesday for an all-new episode of US 101. Until then, we are all done. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go file an extension on my taxes because I am bad with math. I'll see you next week.